which might have meant that Pearl Harbor wouldn't have happened and America wouldn't have joined the Second World War.
So basically what you're saying is that President McKinley was responsible for America going into the Second World War.
And helping us win it.
And you can hear lots more of that on the Where Politics Meets History podcast, hosted by Tessa Dunlop and myself. Subscribe on Global Player. Coming up in the next hour, it's Tuesday's Cross Question. With us are Satvir Kaur, the Labour MP for Southampton Test, Sir Roger Gale, Conservative MP for Herne Bay and Sandwich, William Atkinson, Assistant Content Editor for The Spectator, and Aid Thompson, who is the host of the podcast Aid Thompson and Other Disappointments. Well, he's not going to disappoint us in the next hour, because if he does, he won't be back. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call if you have a question for our panel. You can WhatsApp us on that number, and of course you can watch us on Global Player.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, the White House says the days of the US being ripped off are over. Donald Trump's in talks with his trade and tariff team, finalising details of the levies on global economies. Rory Stewart, former Conservative International Development Secretary, told LBC the US is attempting to fight a culture war.
It's basically a war against a form of liberalism that they don't like. And what I think we can expect is that there will be more and more interference in the way in which we run our own countries and an attempt to use tariffs to try to force compliance.
The Prime Minister has admitted the cost of living crisis is ongoing as a host of household bills increase today, but Sir Keir Starmer's promised to make good on his pledge to make people feel better off under Labour. The police watchdog is investigating after a man was shot dead by police outside Milton Keynes train station. It's after reports of a man carrying a firearm. Severe storms are battering many Greek islands. Crete's experiencing the heaviest rainfall while there's been widespread flooding in Mykonos. And the King's returned to public duties after a short stint in hospital after suffering from side effects from cancer treatment last week. Charles has been handing out honours at Windsor Castle. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 51 points at 86.34. The pound buys $1.29 and €1.19. LBC weather staying dry with clear skies for much of the UK tonight. Breezy in the southwest and a low of 1. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello and welcome to Tuesday's Cross Question. I'm Iain Dale. It's 2 minutes past 8. On the panel with me, to my left, Satvir Kaur, Labour MP for Southampton Test. Next to her, Sir Roger Gale, a Conservative MP for Herne Bay and Sandwich. To my right, William Atkinson, who, when he was last here, was working for Conservative Home, but he's shifted to be Assistant Content Editor of The Spectator. And next to him is the satirist Aid Thompson, who's the host of the podcast Aid Thompson and Other Disappointments. They're here to answer your calls on 0345 6060 973. You can WhatsApp us on that number. You can text 84850, and of course you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Right, our first call comes from James in Barnes. James, very good evening. What would you like to ask?
Hi, good evening, Iain. It's a bit of a long-winded question, but do the panel and yourself think that, bearing in mind what we know with Donald Trump and his tariffs, that would it not be a point that the West, meaning Europe and Canada and Japan and Australia and New Zealand, form a coalition? And as Keir Starmer has done with the Ukraine, in inverted commas, and say to America, no, we're not. We are going to stand together, and we are not going to stand for this. Because I think that if Britain start to try and do it, or we want to try and do a deal without Europe, I think it's a foolhardy way to go about it. And I think that there needs to be a coalition of like-minded Western democracies that say to America, we're not going to stand for this nonsense, and put America in their place, quite frankly.
But that's not the way tariffs work, is it? Because if America imposes tariffs on British or European goods, it's not us that pays the tariffs. It's the consumer in America that effectively pays them, isn't it? Sir Roger Gale.
We mustn't cut off our own noses to spite our own faces. That's a platitude, but it's also true. We don't want to do more damage still. And we do trade quite a lot with the United States, and we do want to sell Range Rovers, and we do want to sell Jaguars, and we do want to sell Scotch whisky. And my guess is that we'll go on doing it, and you're right, Ian, they'll pay the price. How far do we go in terms of retaliation? Well, when I was 5, my boxing coach, who was Teddy Peckham, who was the world flyweight champion at the time, said, the only thing to do, son, if they hit you, is to hit him harder. I'm not sure that's entirely the solution, but that's my natural instinct. At the moment, I just want to hit back, and that's not clever. I know that's not clever, but that's how I feel.
You know, you should have been here an hour ago, because I said virtually exactly the same thing as that myself. We've always been on a similar vein, haven't we? Satvir?
I mean, it's difficult because your instinct would be to, I suppose, hit back. What I would say is that a trade war doesn't benefit anybody, and I know there's negotiations and conversations that have been having with Keir Starmer and Johnny Reynolds for quite some time. Tomorrow isn't a deadline. Obviously, the tariffs are going to impact every single country, and then we'll find out what deal we can get. I mean, Southampton, the constituency I represent, has one of the busiest and biggest trade ports, not only in the UK but in the world. And what a lot of businesses are telling me is that they really want and need a sensible and pragmatic approach to this. And I believe that is what Keir is doing at the moment. It's why the Chamber of Commerce have kind of said that the government's approach at the moment is the right one, and they're supporting it.
But do you agree with Roger that it is a bit of head and heart here, that your heart says one thing but your head tells you another?
Yeah, I definitely empathise with that. What I would say is that people's livelihoods in this country and businesses are heavily relying on whatever trade deal comes to fruition, and I think that is both head and heart.
The thing is, though, if you don't stand up to Trump on this, we always argue that, well, if we'd stood up to Putin in 2014 when he invaded Crimea, we might not be having the Ukraine war at the moment. If you don't stand up to these things, worse things can happen down the line.
And I think it's a genuine negotiation. I mean, when Keir went to the Oval Office, I mean, there was so much speculation that was going to be a car crash, and it wasn't. I mean, you had Trump saying himself that Keir was very persuasive, and I think it's a genuine negotiations, and those are happening at the moment.
OK, Aid Thompson.
I think there's a romance, isn't there, to the idea of all of the Western nations ganging up on the US. We would like to see that from a sort of movie narrative perspective to hit the bully back. I think the mistake in taking that route would be the expectation that you were dealing with somebody who subscribed to sense and logic and consistency. And I think even though I was impressed by how well that Oval Office meeting went in the hours or days afterwards, the script had changed again. Everybody's always on the back foot with Donald Trump. We don't know what things are going to be like tomorrow, the next day. My sense is that if we did do that, we would be expecting him to go, oh, OK, well, I'll back down now. Actually, I think the outcome of it would be that he would then big himself up, double the tariffs again. William
Atkinson.
I agree with Aid. We all would like our romantic Love Actually Hugh Grant moment where Keir Starmer, and as the leader of the anti-Trump West, sort of stands up and says, no, Donald Trump, we are not going to put up with your rudeness about Volodymyr Zelensky and your willingness to put tariffs on our products. But I think that's utterly ludicrous, and I'm sorry to say to the caller, a complete fantasy. What Donald Trump's actions have raised to us is just how dependent we have become on the United States. Not only is the sort of cornerstone of the post-war international order, but especially in the last 30 years or so, when we in Europe have chosen butter over guns, and the United States has, remained not only a central prop of NATO, but sort of far exceeded us in its annual growth rates. And I think, if Europe and Japan and Canada, etc., had listened to figures like Charles de Gaulle and Enoch Powell 60 years ago, and had thought that the logical consequence of making ourselves dependent on the United States was ultimately that one day the tide will go out and a US president will repudiate those countries who had previously been his allies, we would be in a better position to respond today. But the strong do what they will, the weak suffer what they must, and in this sense, we are very much the weak.
So all four of you basically adopt the same position. So I want to bring back our caller, James. James, they all disagree with you. What have you got to say?
I think I completely understand their points, and it's logical. But I think that they're wrong. I think that they are allowing, by their attitude, they are basically saying to Donald Trump, do what the hell you want, sir, because we will do and bow down to you and kowtow to whatever your government decides, and we will do whatever you wish. And I think that's just as bad as when people talk about what people do with Putin. There is no difference, and that's I think the analogy between Trump and Putin being on the same level, I think is exactly the same, and I think that they're wrong. And I think that if it means that we suffer a bit more, let us suffer a bit more, because at the end of the day, what do we buy in America? What do we buy in England? We don't buy American cars. Do we buy American food? What do we buy?
We do buy an awful lot from America. The reason we, as I said in the last hour, the reason we don't buy American cars is because generally they're crap. James, thank you very much indeed. Andrew, am I allowed to say that? I think I am, aren't I? Andrew in Fulham says, despite many people's bills rising this month, Sir Keir Starmer said today that as a result of Labour policies, people will in the longer term feel better off. And Rachel Reeves recently quoted a figure of £500 as the amount will soon be better off by. Well, I think she said by 2029, to be fair. However, Kemi Badenoch has also said today that in this Parliament people would actually be worse off by £3,500 as a result of Labour's tax policies. Who should we believe, and is anyone on the panel so far feeling better off under this government? Well, on the first day of awful April, I'm not sure that this is the right day to ask that question, Andrew. Satvir.
Listen, no one likes to see their bills go up. And actually, what I am really happy about is that for the first time in a very long time, wages are growing faster than prices, which is good. We're also seeing a government that's investing in the long term as well. So while there's shorter-term measures to help people, particularly with, for example, energy bills, so we're seeing an expansion of the Warm Homes discount, conversations and negotiations with Ofcom to ensure that there's a debt relief scheme. Longer term, we're investing in homegrown renewables because we know that that is the only way that longer term we can get energy bills down when it comes to your water bill that has gone up. And trust me, Southern Water has gone a little bit crazy where I am. We're actually legislating so that water companies have to invest in infrastructure, which means that longer term, those water bills do not have to go up at the rate they're going up. So I believe that this government is thinking for the long term, is growing the economy. And yes, those figures are right. They're backed by the OBR. I don't think Kemi has actually said where her figures come from or what they're backed up by, but I don't recognise them.
William.
To an extent, I agree. I mean, the reason why everybody feels much poorer than they did, say, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago, is because of a series of policies pursued by the last government and continued by this government. Britain's economy has been structurally dysfunctional for, I would say, probably decades now, in ways that have been very obvious. Say, our appallingly sort of expensive energy, our planning system that makes everything impossible to be built. And though, the current government is doing some things to actually sort of fix those problems, you say, it's enthusiasm for clean energy and the sort of planning bill currently making its way through Parliament. On the other hand, this government is sort of deciding to double down on our high tax, high spending sort of economic model, which is one of the many reasons why it's now having to pursue austerity at the edges to justify, a public sector bill that is getting ever larger. And I think, I don't think this government is really that different from the previous government. It's something I really couldn't say under Conservative Home. But I think in all the ways that it's similar, in all of the ways that really matter, I don't think primarily that is economic policy, it's even worse. And I think, quite frankly, everybody is going to get poorer over the next 4 or 5 years for exactly the same reason they were getting poorer under the Tories. And nothing is really going to change. And I wouldn't be surprised by both of the major parties being swept away in the next election as a consequence. And I hope I could say to your caller that I have a sort of more hopeful message than that. But no, using the word that you just used, Iain, everything in Britain is crap, and it's only going to get much more crap over the next 5 years.
Well, that's a positive thing to say, isn't it? That, I mean, there is a point there, though. When Rachel Reeves said we'll all be £500 better off by 2029-30, I thought, really? Is that all you've got for us?
But we're all enslaved to the bond markets, right? We have a colossal national debt. That is where the taxes go. Every month when you see your income tax deducted from in your payslip, a chunk of that will go towards not just paying off the national debt, just servicing it is around, I think, off the top of my head, is about 100 billion every year. So whenever we hear these press releases about cuts, 500 million to this, $1 billion to that, we're going to save this, we're going to put it back into the treasury, I'm always like, nothing's going to change this situation in any meaningful way for people who are struggling at the moment, not just on the energy bills, which are a serious problem still, but mostly on high taxes. I would love to live in a world where we could slash taxes in that way that, I don't know, Liz Truss or Nigel Farage and Richard Tice now appear to subscribe to a similar theory. The reality is that there's not really any quick fix for this other than monstrous growth or some sort of wealth tax.
And on that bombshell, Roger Gale?
I think A's right to the extent that it's quite clear that Reform have actually no policies to offer whatsoever on any subject. They're a small band who have become very, very good at criticising everything that anybody else does, but haven't actually offered a single viable
Well, you say
policy.
they're a small band. They've got double the membership of the Conservative Party now.
Well, they've got 5 members of Parliament.
But they've got about 220,000 members.
Yes, but membership doesn't translate into seats in Parliament, and they haven't actually got... But the point I'm trying to make, Ian, is you can play those figures as much as you like. The bottom line on this is they haven't got any policies. Not over small boats, not over the economy, not over anything.
But where are the solutions? Where are the actual...
I'm not going to say that we didn't make mistakes, because of course we did. That's a given. We know we made some mistakes. But since the election, Rachel Reeves' first budget was a car crash, and the spring budget has been no better. And we are now spending shed loads of money that we haven't got and can't afford, and we're racking up debt, and the whole country is paying the price. And as a result, in spite of the fact, and I don't want to upset Satvir too much, but nevertheless, yes, incomes have gone up. Provided you've got an income, there are a hell of a lot of people in this country who don't have a working income, so their incomes haven't gone up, but the costs have gone up. Energy costs have gone up. Partly, yes, that's due to Ukraine and to those circumstances. And yes, we have faced enormous problems as a result of COVID and the hangover from that. All of that is true. But the bottom line, I'm afraid, is that this is an economic crisis made in number 10 and number 11 Downing Street.
You don't think that if you're calling this a crisis, I mean, it's difficult.
I think it is a crisis.
Well, I don't necessarily disagree, but you can't blame it all on a government that's only been in power for 9 months.
And also, you talk about crisis. I mean, we had 11% inflation at one point. That was an actual crisis, and where the economy was fundamentally crashed.
Roger and I remember when it was 27%.
I think fundamentally, when I've spoken to businesses, particularly before the election, the reason why they weren't investing in this country or in my neck of the woods was because they were crying out for certainty and stability. And that is why in Rachel's first budget, she offered certainty and stability.
But she also offered gloom and doom, and people don't invest in countries where the Chancellor and the Prime Minister are talking the economy
investment's
down.
gone up. And actually, our public services have fundamentally been on their knees, and we've been investing in our public services because businesses also rely on public services as well, because when you're, and I come from a small business, small family business background, when you're a business and your employees can't come in because the transport system is broken or they're sick and can't get a GP appointment, that will all have an impact on your business. I go into the local co-op and they're having to pay for security guards because retail crime has gone through the roof. We need to invest in public services. That's exactly what we did.
OK, we'll come on to more subjects in just a moment. If you'd like to take part in the programme, the number 0345 6060 973. It's 18 minutes past 8.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
20 past 8 on LBC. Satvir Kaur, the Labour MP for Southampton, Test is with us. Sir Roger Gale, Conservative MP for the idyllically named Herne Bay and Sandwich constituency. William Atkinson, Assistant Content Editor of The Spectator. And Aid Thompson, who presents the podcast Aid Thompson and Other Disappointments. Why did you call it that? It's not exactly... doesn't kind of make you want to listen to it if it's going to be disappointing, Aid.
Well, my USP was, I guess I started it in the pandemic. It was quite a depressive time for everybody. I became a father, and I could no longer escape my house. So I guess that affected.
So you're likening becoming a father to the pandemic. Okay.
And yeah, I don't know, like the USP felt like, let's talk about all of the challenges that we face in the world politically, economically. And so now I like to style it as though I am a Willy Wonka of dystopia, dancing around the climate crisis, nuclear war, economic meltdown.
Leaving your listeners to search for the golden wrapper.
Absolutely. There you go.
Okay. Right. Text question from Carrie. Not that one. Given the financial state our country is in at the moment, why on earth are we willing to send Mauritius £90 million a year? Now, Downing Street today indicated Donald Trump has signed off the UK's handover of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, paving the way for the UK to cede sovereignty over its last African colony after a 6-month standoff. I always think with this that there must be something more to this that we're all missing, because it just seems very, very weird. Aid, let's start with you.
So as I understand it, lawyers from across the world have looked at this deal and agreed that the British state doesn't have a legal right to that territory. And effectively, we've been occupying it, and now is the time to hand it back. And part of that deal includes a financial settlement. So
with a country that's never actually owned the Chagos Islands.
That side, I don't know. But that is the nuts and bolts of it, as I understand it. Should we pay them that amount? Honestly, I don't know. But I do find it really interesting that the same people who voiced their concern about this amount of money seem to think that the EU referendum divorce bill was money well spent, when it was around the same. It was like 40 billion for that. But this is a waste of money. Let's have some consistency here.
Okay, William?
Oh, well, I don't think, comparing it to the divorce bill is quite a useful comparison, because that was part of the tortuous, yes, and very badly handled negotiations to deliver on, what was the largest democratic vote in this country's history. So I think there's more justification than the justification that we currently have for the Chagos deal, which is that Keir Starmer's best friend is quite close to the Mauritian government. And he has therefore decided that to make him happy, he's going to get the taxpayer to pay to hand away a part of British territory. I mean, I think ultimately I struggle to get exercised by this. I think it's obviously a ludicrous deal, and it's obviously being done through a small group of friends to keep themselves happy. But I think I wrote for Conservative Home before I left that I would just simply gift these islands to Donald Trump, because the only reason why we've kept them is because they have an American base on them. There is no actual strategic interest in Britain keeping these islands. They are so the United States can one day have its silly little war with China. And
silly little war with China.
Yes, I mean, which I don't want.
I think you're probably the only person in the world that will ever have uttered that statement.
Yeah, and I don't want Britain to play any part in that. So, quite frankly, give away the islands. But the idea that the taxpayer should pay to give them away is something that I find very difficult to sort of comprehend. Quite frankly,
Roger Gale, isn't it simpler than that? The £90 million presumably is the rental for Diego Garcia, so we can rent the base.
This is the politics of the madhouse. First of all, international law does not require us to hand the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, or indeed to anybody else. There's a ruling that says we're not where we ought to be. But there's nothing in international law that can compel us to do what we're doing, which is to placate a few chums under the old PALS Act, as far as I can see, and William did refer to this, of Mr. Starmer's. So what we're doing is giving away some fairly important territory, strategically important territory, that we don't have to give away, and then we're paying shed loads of money to rent back Diego Garcia, so that the Americans, not we, but the Americans can have a base there.
But presumably the Americans are going to pay a lot of this money.
Well, if the Americans want to have the base there, then why aren't they renting it? And just for the record, if they want the base there, why aren't they renting it from us and not from Mauritius?
Well, I think they are.
It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It's ludicrous beyond belief.
Is it possible that this is woven into any preliminary discussions about the US trade deal? So they go over and see Donald Trump, JD Vance. They talk about maybe this features in that conversation.
Well, if they did, that worked well, didn't it?
Well, I mean, we're told today that there's some abortion clinic case about a protest that is somehow being part of this trade. I mean, the world's going mad, frankly.
There's reports this afternoon that they want to inject free speech protections into any UK trade deal.
Please. Satvir.
Just on that, I think Johnny Reynolds kind of clarified that that's got nothing to do with the trade deal, but yes, it did seem a bit far-fetched. When it comes to the Chagos Islands, no, I have to disagree. I don't think it's got anything to do with who Keir is friends with or who happens to be in the Oval Office. It's clear that this has been going on through successive governments, so it actually started under the Conservatives, so both can be up in arms. But
it was also stopped by the Conservatives under David Cameron.
But those conversations, well, David Cameron's left a while ago, but those conversations continued under the Conservatives. This government has picked it up, and it's to do with national
because
security.
There's no obligation
I'm going to be honest, I don't know the ins and outs of, Aid seems to know a lot more than I do behind the scenes.
I'm just wildly speculating.
Behind the scenes, we know that it's strategically linked to national security, which is why Number 10 and the government is looking at it, which is why the previous government looked at it. But to claim that it's got something to do with who Keir is talking to at any given day, I think is ridiculous.
Right, let's move on. Carl in Manchester says, were the Sentencing Council right to try to solve the unfairness which non-white people face from police and courts? Now, the Sentencing Council's new guidelines, which would have asked judges to take account of the guilty person's age, sex and ethnicity when deciding what legal penalty they should face, was due to come into effect today. But this was suspended yesterday. The Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, is now taking steps to pass a law to stop these guidelines from coming into effect. This is quite a difficult one to follow. Take us through the arguments here, William, if you would.
So, a sort of sentencing sort of report, as far as I can tell, and I must admit I never followed my mother's advice to go and be a barrister, is something that can be produced, which can then be sort of handed to a judge who's ruling on a particular case. And what would have occurred if these guidelines had gone through was that the judge in that particular case, via the sort of sentencing report generated by the Sentencing Council, a sort of quango set up by, I think, the Tories, would have essentially advised that those who had a selection of particular characteristics, referring to sort of sex, to their particular religion, to their race, etc., would be advised that they should have non-custodial sentences, or indeed shorter sentences, based on those particular characteristics. And due to, first of all, the campaigning of Robert Jenrick, and then the decision of Shabana Mahmood to criticise the Sentencing Council and ask to change these guidelines, and then suggest that the government was going to put emergency legislation into place to change these guidelines, the Sentencing Council has then suspended the guidelines. And I think, again, this is one of those issues in which whatever your sex, whatever your race, whatever your religion, etc., we are all equals under the law, and we are all ultimately responsible for our own actions.
But wasn't that part of the issue, that if you look at the sentences given to two people with ostensibly the same backgrounds, but one characteristic different, often race, that the person who wasn't white would often get a higher sentence than the person who was. And so the Sentencing Council was saying, well, that's not fair. The judiciary needs to look at that.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure why we're looking at their particular race in the first place. I mean, it doesn't matter if they're black, white, or any other race. I mean, they are individuals who've committed a crime. And
yes,
quite frankly,
but the judges weren't treating them the same. That was the point.
Yeah, so well, no, because I assume that they were treating them as an individual. If it then sort of ends up in totality that people who are black or Asian, etc., have been treated more harshly than somebody who's white, I mean, that's ultimately down to the collective decisions of lots of individuals rather than anything to do with their skin colour, as far as things go. Unless there's an allegation that Britain's judiciary are institutionally racist, which I find unlikely, then yes, any idea that this is a discrimination based solely on the skin colour alone is ultimately ludicrous.
So I know I've got friends that are judges, and I know that when they sentence, they do look at people's circumstances, and I know there's things already in the guidelines around if you're a pregnant woman or you're suffering from mental health, so things like that are already considered. As the only ethnic minority on this panel, I would say that you can't deny that the data looks bad, particularly around, I do think there's a difference around policing and sentencing. The data does look bad when it comes to people from ethnic minorities, but I don't think changing the sentencing guidelines is necessarily the solution to that. I think it's a more holistic approach that you need to take. So I think Shabana was right to call this out and say, actually, everyone needs I want to be treated equally. If, God forbid, I'm done for a crime and have to be sentenced, I don't want special treatment. But I do think that we do need to look at policing in and around and why it's the case that more black and brown people are being arrested and sentenced, for example. But I do think there needs to be a more sensible and holistic approach rather than this knee-jerk reaction that we've seen at the moment from the Sentencing Council, but they've obviously withdrawn now.
Roger?
The Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards says very fiercely that under the separation of powers, members of Parliament must not interfere with the judiciary. Well, this is a classic case of precisely why, on occasions, we damn well have to interfere with judiciary, because otherwise the law would be an ass. What was being proposed was a two-tier sentencing system, and that was not right. You can't have a two-tier sentencing system. It has to be one tier, but one law for everybody. And the idea that a group of people behind closed doors can say, and these are the guidelines we're issuing to judges to tell them how to go about sentencing, is a nonsense. And I'm very glad indeed that both Robert Jenrick and Shabana Mahmood agreed on this, took the bull by the horns and are dealing with it, have dealt with it.
But some people would say, well, politicians shouldn't get involved in sentencing. It ought to be just for the judiciary to decide these things.
It's up to us to decide whether or not there should be a two-tier justice system, and the answer is there should not.
Okay, Aid?
I feel like the two-tier thing, like you can look at the judiciary and you could apply that two-tier label at 2 points. You could say, if we let off people of colour with a lighter sentence, then that is two-tier, because a Caucasian individual would then get sent to prison. That is two-tier. However, if you don't have something that responds to the statistics where people of colour are more likely to receive harsher sentences, you already have a two-tier system, don't you? Because they're more likely to have a lengthier sentence. So statistically, if you pan out a bit and you say, look, this group of people are more likely to get custodial than this people, we need to put some sort of system in to balance it better.
I do think the point that I feel like we're agreeing. I think the point that Roger was making,
far too much agreement on this panel tonight.
I've been told, was making was this idea around democracy and actually how involved should politicians be in that system. And actually, I do think that we are governing, and sometimes we do give a lot of power away around decision making. And actually, I didn't have an issue with Shabana coming in and actually saying this isn't right and this won't deliver the outcomes that we're potentially looking for. But I do agree that clearly the data shows, and the data doesn't lie, there is a disparity. But I believe that can be dealt with in a different way and should be dealt with in a different way.
Right, some very thoughtful discussions, even if our panel are agreeing far too much. Let's see what happens in the next half an hour. It's 8:33 on LBC. Let's get the news headlines with Daryl Jackson.
The White House has insisted companies who make in America will face no tariffs as Donald Trump prepares to announce sweeping import taxes tomorrow. They're due to take effect immediately. A man's been shot dead at a train station in Milton Keynes following reports of someone carrying a firearm. Officers were called to the city's central railway station at just before 1 o'clock this afternoon. And US prosecutors have been told to seek the death penalty for Luigi Mangione, the man accused of shooting dead a healthcare executive in New York. Brian Thompson was killed in the street last year. LBC weather staying dry with clear skies for much of the UK tonight, breezy in the southwest and a low of 1 degree.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:35 on LBC. With us on the panel, Labour MP Satvir Kaur, Conservative MP Sir Roger Gale, William Atkinson from The Spectator, and podcaster Aid Thompson. And it's Thompsin. I've never heard of a Thompsin before. You are unique, but easy to search for on the podcast.
Do you know what? I only changed my name to Thompsin so that people at my then...
Oh, you changed it?
Yeah, like it's a sort of stage name because at the time I had a day job that I really didn't want people to be able to find me, and then
what was
it sort of stuck. It was in the city.
Oh, fascinating. I got more than I bargained for there.
Did it work?
Yes, but do you know what? There was like a sort of invert side effect to it where then nobody could find it at all. Like you type in the name and then it would correct it to like the Thompson twins.
Actions have consequences. Danielle in Hull says thousands of council workers are on six-figure salaries while some people can't even get their bins changed and have seen their council tax bills go up by 10% today. Should councils really be paying these kinds of wages when they're all skint? Well, research by the Taxpayers Alliance think tank of local authorities across Britain has found that almost 4,000 employees are paid £100,000 or more. Council tax rose by 5% across most parts of England today, while a few areas in which the local authority's financial situation is particularly perilous were given permission to increase their council tax bills by up to 10%. Birmingham, where a major incident has been declared over the rubbish piling up on streets during a strike by bin collectors, increased its council tax rates by 7.5% today. So, it's always a difficult one, isn't it? Because you always think, well, no one begrudges someone a good salary, but you look at some of these, there's several that are earning over £500,000 a year. When you think the Prime Minister of this country, I think, earns £170,000, you think, well, isn't that job more difficult than... And some of these people aren't even chief executives of the council. Let's start off with Satvir.
So I actually used to be a local council leader.
That's why I started off with you.
Thanks very much. I actually don't recognise, I wish though, that we had the money to spend kind of £500 million on salaries. This is just a theory, by the way. I think basically what's happened is councils have really struggled under austerity for the last 14 years. They've been absolutely gutted. 40p in every pound has gone. They've really struggled to fund frontline services. There's been huge transformation that councils have had to go through. And I believe that especially when you're struggling, you're looking for the best people you possibly can that can take you through that journey. And the only people they can find is those from, not necessarily, but often from the private sector who come with massive pay packets. That's my theory of essentially what's happened here. Now, do I think it's right? Because it is public money and taxpayers' money? Probably not. I think a better solution is that councils are funded properly, so they're not lurking from one crisis to another, so they don't have to import people to try and take them out of every crisis at a time, and have long-term settlements, which the government is honouring at the moment. And, you can really see that coming to fruition at the moment. I think what's happening in Birmingham is horrible. We've had experiences of bin strikes in Southampton in 2012. Back then it was a Conservative council, and actually it doesn't really benefit anybody. And I really feel for council leaders that are really struggling to balance the books and offer frontline services in an increasingly difficult situation and circumstances. And I know they're working really closely with the unions to come to a solution with that, because obviously it's clearly having a huge impact to local residents.
A couple of people texting, actually it's the same person texting in from Southampton, saying the chief executive of Southampton City Council is on £400,000 a year and they are broke, especially when Satvir ran the council.
I can tell, I don't know the name of this texter. Paul. No, that is not true. My chief exec did not earn 400,000, but I'm happy for you to contact me directly and can tell you who he was and how much he actually did earn.
Well, I'm told that Southampton City Council advertised for a new chief executive on a salary of between 173,000 and 205,000. The accounts for the council last year had a deficit of £39 million. I don't know, but Paul, I don't know where you got your 400,000 figure from, but it's clearly wrong. Roger, how much is your local council chief executive paid?
I think Colin Carmichael, who's the chief executive of Thanet District Council at the moment, he retired from Canterbury and then he moved seamlessly across the Thanet, is actually A, doing a very good job under very difficult circumstances, and B, is worth every penny he pays. I actually don't know how much he's paid, but he's good. Now, that said, for these 14 years of austerity, or most of those years, under Conservative control, the three district councils in my area, Canterbury City, Dover District and Thanet, were efficient and well run.
Because they're districts.
I'm afraid recently... I'm afraid recently, at the moment, they've gone down the Swanee under Labour control. But that's got not a lot to do with the thrust of this story, which is the fact that over weeks now, the bin men of Birmingham have been on strike, rats are having a field day, disease is potentially rife. And I've actually got one colleague in the House who told me today he happens to have one road in the area that's affected and the rest of his constituency isn't. And on one side of the road, it's his constituency, and the other side, it's the affected area. So on one side of the road, the bins are being emptied.
Oh, no.
And on the other side of the road, the rubbish is piling up. And natural inclination is being ignored. People are not actually taking their black sacks across to the other side of the road.
3 o'clock in the morning.
No, they're behaving properly. What they want is a proper service provided by Birmingham that, frankly, is a rubbish council.
And has been for a number of years, I think, under both parties, it has to be said. William?
I agree with Satvir, actually. I think it was one of sort of George Osborne's worst decisions to, first of all, pile on the cost of social care onto our local councils, and then I think also cut local council funding by 25%, because the costs of an ageing population mean that social care is rising in cost exponentially, and that is, I think, makes up 60 to 70% of the sort of budgets of most local councils. And I think both major parties, allow Labour with the sort of Casey review and the Tories previously with their failure to implement Bill Not.
In Kent, that's a county council responsibility. I was talking about local authorities. Kent County Council actually also has been very well run, and under difficult circumstances has been providing the social services that are required.
Well, I'm very glad for your constituents that that's the case. Nonetheless, in the aggregate, both major parties have sort of kicked the social care can down the road, and until the government actually chooses to grasp the nettle and either implement the Dole Not review or come up with their own solution and implement it as quickly as possible and find some sustainable way of financing it, our local councils will continue to go bankrupt en masse. And quite frankly, I understand the reason why we limit the increases by which our council tax can increase every year to only 5%. But I mean, and I say that as somebody whose council tax bill has just gone up by the full amount. But nonetheless, if councils are going bankrupt, I think they should be able to raise it by more. I mean, no major party has tried to reform this funding in sort of 30 odd years. And it is one of those many things that, as I said earlier, which was terrible under the Tories, is going to get worse under Labour, and which no major party is, quite frankly, willing to deal with.
Aid?
I feel like, so just to go back to the original question about salaries of chief executives in local authorities and councils, I feel like they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. Like if they want to attract the highest calibre, most able, proven resources from the private sector to come in and do a good job, then they have to pay almost private sector rates, probably with a few nice public sector benefits thrown in. If they choose to...
A 27% contribution to pensions.
Something like that would be lovely.
Wouldn't it? Wouldn't we all like that?
Maybe you could clock out every day at 3 o'clock as well. But if they choose to slash that salary that they put on offer down to, I don't know what the going rate is, let's say it's 400k, they slash that down to 200k, and they hire someone in with less experience who is less qualified, less able, and then they mess up, the papers would maul them for it. So I don't envy anyone that's in a position that has to decide the salaries of those individuals. I think that's a really tough one.
OK. Right, we'll move on in a moment. And, of course, we'll have our fun question for the end of the programme. Stay tuned for that. It's 8:45 on LBC.
LBC.
I'm coming.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:46, Satvir, Kaur, Roger Gale, William Atkinson and Aid Thompson with us answering your questions. Bob is in Chichester. Putin appears to want Zelensky out before he'll consider any potential peace deal. Is this a solution which the West should consider? Well, Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister has said today that the Kremlin can't accept the deal as it currently stands because it does not fulfil its main demands, namely to solve the problems related to the root causes of this conflict, which is widely understood to mean Zelensky's pro-Western government in Kyiv. Sir Roger Gale.
No, absolutely not. Zelensky is in the same vein probably as Imre Nagy and Alexander Dubček and Václav Havel, one of the bravest people in European history. And he deserves our full support, and I hope to God he goes on getting it. He's what's standing between the collapse of democracy in Europe and Putin.
So when they say that it's the causes of the original war which need to be resolved, which aren't being resolved in this Trump plan for a ceasefire, that effectively surely means, Satvir, that they have to have the full defeat of Zelensky, otherwise they won't consider any proposals at all.
Well, you'd hope that's not the case if they genuinely want peace, which let's be optimistic here and hope that Russia does want peace. I mean, they're running out of resources, so hopefully they do run out. I think it is really important that we continue to support Ukraine and Zelensky, and I agree with Roger again. There you go. The answer is no, and I'm actually kind of really pleased that that time when Zelensky came from America and the Oval Office and kind of that big drama that you watched and kind of thought, is this actually happening? Is this real? That actually he came to the UK and Keir welcomed him the way he did as a friend, and people came on the streets and cheered him, and I think that is indicative of British values, and actually I think that the whole country is supportive of Zelensky and what he's trying to do, and is why we're fully behind him and Ukraine, because stability and security in Ukraine is stability and security within our continent and our country.
Can I just come back and add one thing to that? In view of what Satvir has just said, of course, he was welcomed properly by Keir Starmer and Number 10. And he was also flown to Sandringham to meet King Charles.
Oh, yeah, of course.
And what was Trump's comment after that? Oh, I don't feel special anymore. Come on.
You seem surprised.
No, I suppose I'm not really. It's sad, isn't it?
Aid.
I think it's interesting when they talk about resolving the underlying fundamental causes of this conflict. The underlying fundamental causes are that Ukraine has an awful lot of natural resources. Putin would really like to get his hands on them. Previously, it was seen to be something of a logistics channel for Russia if they did capture it. The underlying fundamental causes are that they invaded and they need to get out. If they're in a position where they're making demands whilst also suffering from depleted resources at home, like we want Zelensky out as part of any peace deal, sounds absolutely ridiculous.
William?
Ultimately, the sort of situation in Ukraine will be resolved between the two most important powers involved in it, which are the United States and Russia. And if Europe is serious about sort of backing Zelensky, who I agree is a very heroic figure from a Ukrainian perspective, if Europe is willing to sort of basically sort of stand up for the United States when it eventually says we're out, we're not bothered about this anymore, we want to make a deal with Putin won't make a deal. If you want to keep fighting, well, that's up to you in Europe. We need to be talking about raising defence spending to 5-6%, and we should have been talking about that 3 years ago when this invasion began, rather than doing so now. And if not, we're in no position to negotiate. And quite frankly, in that case, this is going to be decided between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. And if that's the terms that they come to, then Zelensky will have to go, because otherwise the United States is not going to continue to support his country. As I said earlier, the strong do what they will, the weak suffer what they must. And Zelensky is ultimately a pawn in a game between much larger and more powerful sort of states.
And that comes pretty much straight out of Putin's playbook, doesn't it?
Well, you can sort of see that. I think I'm seeing the sort of reality that we continue, and far too many politicians in this country and across Europe sort of have denied for the last 3 years.
Happily, some of us still believe that there are things worth fighting for.
Then, while our party was in government, we should have fought to raise defence spending to 4% in 2022, rather than messing around trying to make Liz Truss Prime Minister. If we did, we might be in a position to continue to back Zelensky as soon, if Donald Trump chooses to back away. The reality is that we're not, and the future of Ukraine will not be decided by the United Kingdom.
We've got a government that is backing defence spending, and it is going
Great. Then let's raise it to 5% rather than 2.5% merely to cover.
If we had time, and unfortunately we haven't, I'd give you a lesson in European history, but you could not be more wrong.
Well,
fair enough.
And the point is surely that if that happens, and if we go down that road, Putin will regard it as a victory, and therefore he would be encouraged to invade other countries as well.
Potentially he would be encouraged to do so, but A, he's 72 years old. B, he's barely been able to invade. He's barely been able to evade a fifth of Ukraine. I find it unlikely that he would then be able to advance on multiple fronts to take, say, all the Baltic states and make his way all the way to Poland as well. But I think the underlying importance of that is that Europe should then get serious about its defence. We are not serious about defence. We are not spending the amounts that we should if we want to stand up against Putin.
Iain, I led the UK delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe for 5 years. The Council of Europe, after Crimea had been invaded, the Russians left. The Council of Europe, in the teeth of our opposition as Brits and the Baltic states, let the Russians back in. It was that signal that sent a very clear message to Putin.
Yeah.
It's okay to go ahead.
Yeah.
It wasn't okay. It's not okay now.
Well, I don't know if you saw this Twitter thread from Mike Martin, the Lib Dem MP for Tunbridge Wells, who's a former soldier. His theory is that if Putin prevails in Ukraine, what he will do is threaten to invade Estonia, and troops will go up to the border, as they did in Ukraine, and then NATO will have a really difficult decision to make. We have troops in Estonia. Starmer would then have to get on the phone to Trump to say, will we invoke Article 5? Trump will say no. Where's Estonia? And therefore NATO collapses, and Putin will have achieved everything he wanted to do. That's the danger.
No, I mean, that is the danger, but that's also the reality of the situation, right? Because we're not serious about defence. Far too many countries in Europe aren't serious about defence. We're currently unable to fight for Estonia if we were required to do so. You know, Aris Sassinos at Unheard wrote a very good article on our lack of preparedness last year for Unheard, which I urge everybody to read. And as I say, I don't like Vladimir Putin. I think Volodymyr Zelensky is an incredibly heroic man. I don't want Ukraine to be carved up. But if we're starting from that position, we need to start from the position of being serious about our defence and filling in the vacuum that the Americans are going to leave. And that means we should be raising defence spending to at least 5%, because we are not being serious about the realities of what it will entail.
Right, let's have a quick question from Harry, who says, Kemi Badenoch told Nick Ferrari this morning she believed a conspiracy theory about Adolescence being based on a true story, but with a race-swapped main character. Only to then, I don't understand what that means, only to then confess she hadn't even watched it. Is this really the leader who can save the Conservatives? Now, when previously asked about the theory, writer and co-creator Jack Thorne said, it's absurd, it's not true. We're not making a point about race with this. We're making a point about masculinity. Well, William, let's come to you first on that.
Well, actually, I've been sort of writing about Adolescence for the Spectator's Leader this week, which I can urge everybody to read in a couple of days' time. I think it's genuinely a conspiracy theory. You know, they have said that this isn't based on any particular case, but I think what is the obvious glaring error within Adolescence is that it's based around the idea that this is a young boy who's clearly very bright, from a very stable family, who has watched a couple of Andrew Tate videos and has then been inspired to brutally murder a classmate. And you know, the statistics tell us that young people who commit these sort of heinous crimes tend to come from broken homes, and they tend not to be sort of well-adjusted individuals who suddenly decide one day to sort of kill somebody else their age. But they tend to be people who are known to social services for a very long time and have a long history of mental health problems. So in that respect, I think Adolescence, while being a very good drama and being especially the one-shot thing is incredibly impressive, is very unrealistic, and it shouldn't be pushed forward as it currently is being, as a sort of cautionary tale to the nation's young man.
But what's the race element here? Because I mean, the detective was black, but I'm struggling to see what that's got to do with anything.
The narratives that I read about this were along the lines of, look at this story that happened in reality a couple of years ago. This was a young child of colour, and this is what they've based Adolescence on.
I see.
And now the child in this one is white, so they're whitewashing. It's ridiculous. The producer, the writers of the show have debunked it. I don't really know why the leader of the opposition is still talking about it.
Satvir?
So I have seen Adolescence. I thought it was a really powerful drama, and actually kind of taking to one side whether it's true or not, and clearly it's been made clear that it is a piece of fiction. I do think this is where the arts and film sometimes get it really right in sparking a conversation and getting people that ordinarily people that ordinarily wouldn't talk about an issue like this starting to talk about it. I mean, on the doorstep, I'm having parents talk about, oh, actually, you know, we're really worried for our children because they're at home, but it's almost like they're living online and we don't understand their world. Now, obviously, dramas, by their very nature, are going to go to extreme cases. But actually, what I think was so powerful about that is that you can get elements of it and relate to it and say and reflect on your own life. And, you know, government has a huge programme about violence against women and girls. We're looking to halve it. You know, there's a whole piece and priority around online misogyny. But I believe that what this drama actually is really great at doing is for so many and the millions that have watched it is getting them to think about their lives, think about their family dynamics, and I think that's really powerful. And there's nothing wrong in that. But like going to the extremes of this must be a reality, I just think is absolutely ridiculous.
I thought the most powerful scene, I thought, was when the detective had a conversation with his son about Instagram pictures. He said,
the emojis.
The emojis.
Blew my mind.
He had to explain the emojis to his detective father, who completely missed the significance of these on the boys, the guy who murdered the girl, on his Instagram feed. And I'm thinking that just demonstrates the difference between the generations. Roger?
This generation hasn't watched it yet.
Maybe you should.
It's on my butt. Well, it won't surprise you to know, Ian, that some of us don't have a great deal of time to watch television while we're doing other things.
That's what Kemi said today.
Well, she's right, actually. But it's on my bucket list. What I do know is that it's clearly made a huge impact because I've read a great deal about it. And from the sound of it, it's a very good thing that Netflix are making it available free to schools.
Yeah.
And if it is as good as it's cracked up to be, and I have no reason to suppose it isn't, then that can only be a good thing.
Right, let's go to our fun question from Baz in Warwick. US Senator Cory Booker has been speaking on the Senate floor about the dangers which Trump poses for the last 20 hours. If you had to speak for 20 hours, pretty much non-stop, which topic would you talk about? I'm sure you've done this, Roger.
I'm told that the parliamentary record for a long speech is John Golding, former Labour Member of Parliament, who spoke for 9 hours through the night.
Wow.
Second was Ivan Lawrence, who I think spoke for 8 hours.
Do you know what it was on?
I'm not... No. Well, most of it, I think, came out of the London Telephone Directory, but which was read into the record. Perhaps I'm being scurrilous, but why not? I'm tempted to say, I think I'd follow the American Congresswoman and spend 9 hours talking, or however many hours talking about criticisms of Donald Trump.
Congressman.
But failing that, I talk about something that I know a lot about and I'm very, very interested in. I could speak very easily for a very long time indeed about all aspects of animal welfare.
You could. I just knew you were going to say that, and your wife would have written the speech for you.
Well, either she would or I'd have done it by AI.
And European history for William. So, yeah.
No, I wouldn't bother with that. No, I'd concentrate on animal welfare.
Well, I definitely don't think I can talk for that long. Actually, my predecessor, Alan Whitehead, was known for his very, very long speeches in the House. In fact, the Whips say how much they miss him because when they really needed someone to fill in, like Alan was their guy. But I don't think I prefer shorter, more snappy speeches. I mean, I'm very passionate about housing. I think if you get good quality, affordable housing, it can intrinsically change your life and you can get better life outcomes. I'm very obsessed with my fantasy football team at the moment. So if you got me on the subject of fantasy football, I'm sure I can bore you to death. I'm doing okay, by the way, in my league, in the few leagues I'm in.
Much better than your local football team.
Yeah, do you know, initially I tanked because I decided to put Southampton players
well, that was
in, and that was
mistake,
like the biggest mistake. So I've had to play a lot of catch up, but we'll be fine. We'll be back.
Okay. William?
I would pick the former US President, Calvin Coolidge, who's always been of great interest to me, but also because he himself was famously a sort of taciturn man. I think his inauguration speech was under 300 words, and he was famously asked at a party by a lady sitting next to him, I bet somebody, before I came to this party, President Coolidge, that I could get you to say more than 3 words, and he merely turned to her and said, "You lose." So I think he would be my subject of choice.
Aid?
I'm going to be the curveball here. I would choose to speak substanceless blether for, like, I host a podcast.
Well, you've done this hour.
Yeah. I host a podcast twice a week for 2 hours by myself most of the time, and it's like I can talk for England. I've driven people to tears before on long car journeys by just deliberately talking blether. So that's what I would do.
Okay.
Hours. I'd go for.
Well, tune in to Aid's podcast and find out whether he lives up to his billing. Thank you all very much indeed for coming on the programme tonight. On tomorrow's panel, we have the barrister and broadcaster Hashi Mohammed, the Financial Times political journalist Lucy Fisher, Labour MP Rachel Taylor, and Tory peer Stuart Jackson. Coming up in the next hour, though, have you got an obese child? Because if you have, apparently you can get your child Ozempic, Mounjaro, whatever they're called, these diet limiter contraptions which will make your child lose weight. I think this is appalling. A lot of people swear by them. I know so many people that are using particularly Ozempic at the moment, to varying degrees of success, I have to say. Some people lose weight very, very quickly. Others seem to think they can stuff their faces and drink themselves silly and it'll all be okay, but you do actually have to change your diet as well. So should Ozempic be prescribed for 6-year-olds?
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation, this is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the White House has described Donald Trump's looming announcement on trade tariffs as one of the greatest days